The wind hit Providence, New Mexico at 3:17 p.m. on February 9th, 1884. It did not arrive with gentle warning. It was a physical blow, a solid wall of force and ice that slammed into the mining town from the north. The temperature, a brisk but tolerable 10 degrees, plummeted 40 degrees in less than 20 minutes. The sky, calm gray a moment before, became a roiling horizontal chaos of white. Inside the mountain, Diego Morales felt nothing but a faint high whistle as the wind found a tiny gap in the seal of his sturdy wooden door. He checked the thermometer mounted on the interior stone wall. It read a steady 52 degrees. He tossed one seasoned log into the small cast-iron stove not for warmth, but for the cheerful light it would provide. His chestnut mare, Bronze, shifted in the adjoining stall, also carved from living rock, her soft snort full of contentment. Outside, the world was ending. Inside, it was just another Tuesday. Diego knew he had done the work. Now all he had to do was wait. 2 years earlier, in the spring of 1882, Diego Morales had been the subject of curiosity, then pity, and finally open ridicule. An orphan who had come west at 16, he had spent the next 15 years not chasing gold, but studying the earth itself. He had worked in the silver mines not as a blaster, but as a surveyor's assistant, then as a carpenter bracing tunnels, and finally as a junior engineer. He learned the language of stone, the stoicism of granite, the treachery of shale, the secrets of thermal mass. He saw how even on the most brutal winter days, the temperature 50 feet inside a mine never varied more than a few degrees from the annual average of 54 degrees. He watched as wooden supports, thick as a man's waist, groaned and snapped under the immense pressure of the mountain, while the stone itself remained unmoved, eternal. When he had saved enough, $300, a small fortune earned through quiet frugality, he did not buy a lot in town or a piece of flat grazing land. He went to the land office and spoke with Alcalde Hernandez, a man whose ambition was exceeded only by his conventionality. Diego laid a map on the counter, his finger tapping a parcel of land 2 miles north of town that everyone considered worthless. It was a sheer granite bluff, a 200-foot cliff facing south, overlooking a creek. Nothing could be built on it. Nothing could be grown on it. Alcalde Hernandez squinted over his spectacles. That's old Miller's parcel. Son, solid rock. Nothing there but a cliff face and scrub pine. You can't build a cabin on a 60-degree slope. Diego nodded. His calm manner was often mistaken for slowness. I don't intend to build on it. Alcalde, I intend to build in it. The alcalde blinked. In it? Like a badger? Diego pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. It was a detailed blueprint, a cross-section of the bluff. He had sketched a main chamber 18 feet wide and 24 feet deep, with a vaulted ceiling of 10 feet. Adjacent was a smaller chamber, a stall for his horse. A narrow chimney for a stove was designed to follow a natural fissure in the rock upward to the surface. He had calculated the tonnage of stone to be removed, the tools required, and the approximate time. It was the work of an engineer, not a madman. Alcalde Hernandez stared at the blueprint, a slow smile of indulgent amusement spreading across his face. Son, he said, clapping Diego on the shoulder. This is 1882. We have sawmills. We build proper wooden frame houses, civilized houses. We left caves behind 1,000 years ago. What, in God's name, makes you want to live in a hole in the ground? Diego's explanation was patient and technical, which only further alienated the practical men in the land office. He spoke of geothermal insulation. The mountain, he explained, acts as a thermal battery. In summer, it absorbs the heat of the sun, and in winter, it slowly releases it. A dwelling inside the rock would maintain a near-constant temperature, requiring a fraction of the firewood needed for a conventional house. The entrance, facing south, would catch the low winter sun, providing passive solar heating and light. The immense mass of stone would make it impervious to wind, snow load, and fire. It is not a cave, he corrected gently. It is a thermoregulated, structurally superior dwelling that utilizes the natural properties of the landscape. The Ute people built cliff dwellings on these same principles for centuries. They were not primitive, they were smart. The alcalde simply shook his head. He sold Diego the 40-acre parcel for pennies, $10, and the story was all over Providence by supper. The quiet, solitary orphan they called Diego had finally gone mad. He was going to live in stone. The mockery began in earnest the day Diego arrived at his parcel with a wagon full of mining tools and his faithful mare, Bronce, Martin Flores. A rancher whose sprawling two-story house was the largest in the county rode out to watch. Flores had spent over $4,000 on his house, a monument to his success, and the idea of a man choosing to live in a burrow was a personal affront to his sense of progress. He watched as Diego used a star drill and sledgehammer to begin boring the first blast hole. "What's wrong, Morales?" Flores shouted, his voice dripping with contempt. "Tired of living above ground with the rest of us. Decided to join the prairie dogs." The name stuck. At the general store, men asked Thomas Bernal, the owner, if he'd seen the badger that day. Children, picking up their parents' mockery, chanted it when he came to town for supplies. The project was dubbed Morales's Burrow, and later, more simply, the Folly. Rebecca Vargas, the town schoolteacher and a woman who prided herself on her enlightenment, used Diego as a cautionary example in her lessons. She spoke of civilization's march from caves to huts to the fine wooden homes. Everyone enjoyed. Senor Morales, she explained to her students, represents regression, a step backward into darkness. We should pity him, not emulate him. Even Dr. Hector Blanco, a man of science, found it absurd. He cornered Diego outside the store one afternoon. "Diego, a man's lungs need fresh, circulating air. A damp cave is a breeding ground for consumption and rheumatism. You are inviting disease." Diego tried to explain that his design included a ventilation system with fresh air intake at floor level and the stove chimney drawing out stale air. "It won't be damp, doctor. Granite is non-porous. It will be much drier than a log cabin with cracks in the chinking." The doctor simply sighed and walked away, shaking his head. The town had decided. Doing something so unnecessarily complicated and strange became known as pulling a Morales. The work was brutal, methodical, and lonely. For 2 years, Diego Morales labored. His days were a rhythm of steel against stone. He drilled series of holes, carefully measured, and placed small, precise charges of dynamite, just enough to fracture the rock, not shatter it. The explosions were small, muffled coughs, not great roars. Then came the back-breaking work of clearing the rubble. He used a wheelbarrow and sledgehammer, breaking larger pieces into manageable ones. Bronze, fitted with a special harness, dragged sleds loaded with stone out of the growing cavern and dumped them by the creek bed, where Diego carefully stacked them into a retaining wall. Townspeople sometimes rode out on Sundays, turning the construction site into local entertainment. They watched him, shirtless under the summer sun, muscles lean and hard, face perpetually covered in rock dust. They saw a man engaged in what they considered pointless, insane labor. He never reacted to their taunts. He simply worked. He was meticulous. He kept a journal, noting progress. June 12, 1882. Advanced main chamber 2 feet. Total depth now 8 feet. Used 4 charges. Bronze hauled approximately 3 tons of debris. He framed the entrance with heavy timber, 12-inch pine beams he'd traded a logger for, creating a 20-foot-long, 8-foot-wide vestibule that acted as an airlock. This, he knew, was a crucial buffer zone between the outside world and his stable interior climate. Inside, the walls were not left rough. He spent 4 months smoothing them with hammer and chisel, not for aesthetics, but because smooth walls would prevent moisture collection and reflect light more evenly. He carved niches for shelves, a platform for a bed and workbench. Bronze's stall was a masterpiece of stable engineering with a sloped floor for drainage and a feed trough carved from the same living rock. The total cost of his materials, including the $22 cast iron stove, dynamite, drill, bits, and lumber, came to $187. Martin Flores had spent more on the glass for his parlor windows. By fall of 1883, the dwelling was complete. He built a thick, insulated wooden door and fitted it into the timber frame. He moved in his few possessions, a cot, a table, 2 chairs, his books on geology and engineering, and his father's old rifle. Townspeople placed bets in the saloon on how long he would last. The consensus was that he would be begging for a room at the boarding house by the first big snow, one winter. Everyone agreed. That's all it would take to cure him of his madness. But the first winter was mild, and Diego thrived. His firewood requirement was astonishingly low, He burned less than a cord of wood for the entire season, while his neighbors in their drafty cabins burned 5 or 6. In the summer of 1883, when temperatures soared into the 90s, townspeople sweltered. Inside Morales's burrow, the temperature never rose above 65 degrees. He was cool, comfortable, and content. His quiet success somehow irritated the town more than his supposed madness. They stopped riding out to mock him. His quiet competence took the fun out of it. "Let them watch," Diego told Bronze, brushing her in the cool, stone stall. "Time will tell." The signs began on February 8, 1884. Diego, with his deep understanding of the natural world, noticed them immediately. The air became heavy, carrying a strange metallic smell. Birds, the hardy winter finches and jays, disappeared entirely. He saw a herd of elk descending from the high country with a desperate haste he had never seen before. That evening, the barometer on his wall dropped sharply. He tapped it, but the needle didn't budge. It was not a malfunction. He spent the next day in final preparations. He brought in an extra week's supply of hay for Bronze. He stacked his entire winter supply of firewood, pathetically small by town standards. Just inside the entrance, he checked the door seal and stuffed the tiny remaining gaps with oiled canvas. He filled 4 large barrels with fresh water from the creek, knowing it would soon become inaccessible. He considered riding into town to warn them, but knew how it would be received. The crazy caveman. Predicting doom, they would laugh him out of the saloon. His warnings would just become another part of the joke. Being called crazy is a small price to pay for being alive, he thought, but perhaps too high a price to pay for trying to save those who call you crazy. He stayed put. The storm, when it came, was a thing of mythic force. Locals later called it the White Storm. The snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, grinding stream of ice crystals driven by 70-mile-per-hour winds. Visibility dropped to the length of a man's arm within minutes, then to zero. The sound was a continuous deafening roar, like 1,000 freight trains passing at once. This was a storm that did not simply cover the world. It erased it. The first 24 hours in Providence were a struggle. The next 24, a crisis. By the third day, a catastrophe. The fine wooden frame houses the town had been so proud of proved little more than glorified shacks against the storm's fury. Wind drove snow through every gap and crack. The cold was a physical entity, sucking warmth from the very bones of the buildings. Families huddled around stoves, feeding them constantly, but the heat was stripped away as fast as it was produced. Martin Flores's magnificent house with its many windows was a glacier. He and his family burned a month's supply of wood in 2 days just to avoid freezing. On the 4th day, the first roof collapsed. Thomas Bernal, the store owner, heard the groan of his beams transition into a deafening crack. An avalanche of snow 12 feet deep on his roof crashed into the living space, extinguishing the fire and burying furniture. He and his family barely escaped to the back room. Chimneys clogged with packed snow and ice, filling homes with smoke. Doors froze shut or were buried under drifts to the eaves. The town of Providence was coming apart house by house. Inside Morales's burrow, life continued in calm, insulated comfort. The temperature in the main chamber never dropped below 50 degrees. Even when the fire in the stove went out, the roar of the storm was a distant, muffled rumble, a reminder of a world that no longer touched him. He read his geology books by lamplight, tended to Bronze, and ate his simple meals. He used 2 logs a day, one in the morning to boil coffee, and one in the evening to heat stew. He was safe. He was warm. He was, as always, alone. The first arrival came on the evening of the 5th day. It was not a knock, but a desperate, feverish pounding. Diego opened the heavy door to a blast of Arctic air, and a figure so encased in ice it was barely human stumbled in. It was Dr. Hector Blanco. He collapsed in the vestibule, gasping, his face a mask of frozen terror. "My wife," he wheezed, the words ragged. "She has pneumonia. Our house. The fire is almost out. We've burned the furniture. We'll freeze by morning, please." Diego did not hesitate. He helped the doctor inside, sat him by the stove, and gave him a cup of hot coffee. Then he put on his heaviest coat, grabbed a coil of rope, and followed the doctor back into the maelstrom. It took them an hour to cover the 200 yards to the doctor's house, a trip that should have taken 2 minutes. They half carried the doctor's delirious wife back to the burrow, a sanctuary of warmth and silence in the heart of the howling chaos. They were the first, but not the last. Word spread as if on the wind itself. The next morning it was Thomas Bernal and his family, their faces frostbitten, eyes wide with disbelief at the calm warmth inside the stone walls. They had seen the thin wisp of smoke from Diego's chimney, the only one in the entire area not clogged with snow, and made for it as a last hope. By the seventh day, the procession was constant, one by one, family by family. They came. The very people who had mocked him, called him badger and fool, now fought their way through the storm to the door of his madness. They arrived half frozen, humbled, their pride scoured away by the brutal, indifferent wind. Diego welcomed them all. He shared his food, his water, his warmth, never once mentioning their past mockery. There was no room for gloating, only survival. The main chamber became an improvised infirmary and dormitory, 27 souls, plus a horse, sheltered in the mountain's embrace. The last to arrive were Alcalde Hernandez, accompanied by a nearly frozen Martin Flores. The roof on Flores's magnificent $4,000 ranch had finally collapsed. The weight of the snow had crushed it like a child's toy. They had barely escaped. Hernandez, his face pale and his good suit ruined, stood in the center of the chamber, looking at the faces of his townspeople, safe, warm, and alive, and then at Diego. "We called your work madness," the alcalde said, his voice breaking. This madness saved the lives of 27 people. Diego simply nodded and handed him a blanket. "It doesn't matter now. You're safe. That matters." The storm raged for 2 more days, 9 days total of relentless fury. When it finally broke, the silence was as shocking as the noise had been. The survivors emerged from Morales's burrow into a transformed world, a landscape of alien white sculptures. The devastation in Providence was complete. 14 people had died from exposure and injuries. Dozens had severe frostbite. Of the 80 structures in town, more than half were damaged beyond repair. A week later, after the dead were buried and immediate rebuilding had begun, Alcalde Hernandez called a town meeting in the shell of the ruined church. He asked Diego Morales to stand before the assembled survivors. "I owe you an apology," Hernandez said, his voice clear and firm, echoing in the cold air. "We all do. I called you uncivilized for wanting to live in stone. I was wrong. We built our houses with pride, and the wind took them. You built yours with wisdom, and it sheltered us. I called you a fool, but you were the only one who built for the world as it is, not as we want it to be. You were right. God help me. You were right." Martin Flores stood. "My ranch is gone, but I have money in the bank in Denver. I will pay for the construction of more such shelters for anyone who needs one." He turned to Diego. "If you will teach us." Diego Morales, orphan, badger, fool, stood before them and simply said, "Of course." Over the next year, the hillsides around Providence began to change. Using Diego's techniques and Flores's financing, townspeople began carving new dwellings into stone. They were not just for emergencies. They became primary homes. Dr. Hector Blanco documented Diego's methods, sending detailed letters to engineers at the Colorado School of Mines. The principles of geothermal construction, long understood by ancient peoples, were being rediscovered. By the winter of 1886, 11 families in Providence lived in homes carved from stone. The term, pulling a Morales, was still used, but now it meant doing something with uncommon foresight and intelligence. Diego Morales lived in his burrow for the rest of his life. He never married, but was never alone again. He became the town's most respected elder, a quiet man whose wisdom was sought on all matters of construction and survival. He died peacefully in his sleep in 1918 at the age of 69. The entire town and people from 3 counties attended his funeral. He was buried on the bluff above his home, with a simple stone marker overlooking the valley. Today, Morales's burrow is a protected historical site. The town of Providence survived and flourished over time, its unique stone architecture becoming a point of interest. Engineers and architects still visit to study the elegant simplicity of his design. At the entrance to the dwelling, affixed to the heavy timber frame he installed more than a century ago, is a bronze plaque. It was placed there in 1920 by the townspeople he saved. It reads, Diego Morales, ridiculed as madness, proven as wisdom. When civilization faltered, the mountain endured. He taught us that the strongest shelter is not built against nature, but within it. In this stone, he saved 27 souls and the future of our town. Beside him stood his faithful horse Bratz, the first life saved by this sanctuary. The stone still stands, as stones do. Winds still sweep across the high plains in winter, and snow still falls. But the lesson remains, carved not just in the granite of the mountain, but in the memory of the people. Preparation is not paranoia. It is the highest form of respect for a world that is older, stronger, and far less forgiving than human pride.